can put the link up. I want you to just listen to see if the audio is coming through off your phone. Okay. We are live. These are actually pretty amp too. Okay, posting it to Facebook now.
Yeah, should we believe? Yeah, should we believe?
Okay. You get those.
You get it?
You get those. Oh, good.
Hardwire the mics into this or no?
I didn't have time to fiddle with it. I started to. She asked if I got the mics set right into here, and I started to fiddle with it, but I didn't have enough time to. I figured out how to get this into OBS, taking out the talking. Oh, hello everyone. So I'm guessing getting my. I guess we're getting the ambient voice here probably from a microphone on the computer. Yes. Okay.
Were you doing like?
It might. I tried to look for it and it didn't recognize it.
I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot. So. No.
Okay. Yeah, these are oh yeah, I'm gonna once we start I'm gonna you have the amp? Yep. The amp is down on the floor up there. So once we get close to starting I'm gonna unmute them all and then pull them up. I'm just gonna go check in with it, make sure that everything's good.
You know what else to do with it?
Oh wow.
I don't know if that's my southeastern Pennsylvania dialect that you trained me.
You use linkage. So if something's
Yes. Go figure. I live in Florida. Then Oklahoma.
So am I allowed to ask you some questions?
He's ready for anything.
We can talk about the theological ramifications of circumstances.
Whose jacket's
It's mine.
Oh.
I'm serving it. Just making it false.
This is them. I figured it'd be packed.
So the red microphone started picking up 12 dB second noise. Somebody turn it off. That's 4. It's off. Terry, where's Terry? Oh, it's. Oh, okay. Oh, I said no to that. Nope. It's yellow. Okay. It's just because his mic is off. Yeah. Huh? Yeah. I have them on. See him turn up. We didn't test it with a lot of people in the room. Second. So we didn't test it with a lot of people in the room, so we'll see how it goes.
I'm going to spend 5 minutes with you, just introducing you to the subject. My name is the Reverend Dr. Jerry Wishoff. I taught here at JCC courses in philosophy and world religions for many, many years. And I'm an ordained minister in the Episcopal Church over Adams. We have 2 guys who are going to talk about something very, very important. Far right is Reverend Mahlon Smith. He is senior pastor at New Hope Baptist Church, right there on Marshall Street, across from Rosie's. And Sitting next to him is Jerry Moore, an editorial writer for the Watertown Daily Times. This is a formal debate. We are going to begin with a statement. Mahlon will go first. He's going to defend that statement. And Jerry is going to respond to it afterwards. My job is to moderate, and that means keep order. And I will do that. I would like to just say one quick word. This is a debate that is thousands of years old. It has many forms. If you were a philosophy class, you don't have to be, but you're smart people. There are concepts of knowledge called epistemology. It's how human beings acquire and defend and communicate knowledge. We're going to be talking about that tonight. The ancient Greeks gave us two systems which we use every day. The first is called the a posteriori, which means after the fact. Yes, we can know something and talk about it with knowledge and assuredness only after we have experienced it through one of the multiple senses that we have. We cannot claim knowledge unless it's through the empirical method. Of course, that's what we call science today. The other is called the a priori, which means we have knowledge innate in us, which does not and cannot be proven by empirical evidence. One example, these guys have. One example is that our Constitution and all the laws in our country are framed on the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, etc., you know that. It's impossible to get a tape rule and a scale and prove that everybody here in this room is equal. So you weigh a lot more than I do, and I weigh a lot more than a lot of us do. So there's no such thing as equality in a scientific tradition. So it's some other kind of knowledge we're talking about. So what we deal with here, as human beings, is how do we know these two kinds of knowledge and use them meaningfully, be aware of them, and be aware of them when others are using them with you as well, so that you can follow along what your argument is. Okay, the rules of the debate are very simple. Our first speaker is going to have 15 minutes uninterrupted time to present his argument. After that, Jerry will have 15 minutes to present his argument uninterrupted. After that is done, each of the speakers will have 8 minutes to reply or to rebut, if you will, what you otherwise said. And after that time is over, we will have a brief conversation between them, about 12 minutes. And keep an eye on the clock and let Jarvis do. I don't know how many time is up. After that, there'll be about 45 minutes where you, as an audience, can ask us questions. I would ask that you direct the question to the person, and I'll remind you of this later on. And make it a question, not a sermon, please. So, let us begin. My 5 minutes are up. Anyone? You ready to go? Okay.
If he has issues pulling up his PowerPoint, then help him get it.
The title of this debate is, Should We Believe? Mahlon is taking the affirmative.
Well, I would like to express appreciation to Jefferson Community College for hosting tonight's event, and to Reverend Dr. Jerry Jones and Jerry was involved in tonight's debate. What one believes or doesn't believe about God is the most influential issue that shapes the course of one's approach to life. Tonight we are concerned with what should we believe, theism or non-theism. My opening speech will center about two central tensions. First, should we believe Christian theism, since it best explains reality and human experience? And I would say yes. And second, we should doubt non-theism, since it lacks popular arguments to explain such aspects. Since Mr. Moore will present his case for non-theism, I shall wait to respond to his case to demonstrate the second point. Meanwhile, let's consider some of the arguments for Christian theism. First of all, Christian theism best explains reality and human experience as seen in the following four arguments. Argument 1. God is the best explanation for objective moral values and duties. So what or who ground objective moral values and duties? Stated differently, is it possible to do good without God? Such questions lead us to my opening argument in the overall case for Christian theism, the moral argument. A version of this argument is expressed as follows. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore, God exists. Now, when I say objective, I mean a morality that is the same everywhere, every time, independent of personal opinion and feeling. Moral values deal with goodness and badness. Moral duties deal with rightness and wrongness. In walking about the campus, I see signs that inform students about the badness of forced physical intimacy without consent, i.e. rape, and the goodness of tolerance. All here will hopefully agree that tolerance is a virtue and rape is an evil regardless of whether or not I am on JCC's campus. If you've ever stood in line at a store and someone cut the line in front of you, how often have you said to yourself or to that person, hey, that's not fair? Are such moral values and duties dependent upon my opinion? Did the Nazis commit evil acts, even though they believed what they were doing was good? History, rationality, and everyday experience confirm the objective reality of good and evil. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, if one did not know what a straight line was, then one would not recognize a crooked line when they see it. Because we live in a moral universe with a moral law written into our consciousness, then it stands there is a moral law here. Thus, I would contend that God is the best explanation for objective moral values and duties, and therefore, God exists. Argument number 2. God is the best explanation for why the universe exists. The 17th century polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz raised a question that is one of the oldest in human thought. Why is there something rather than nothing? In raising this question, Leibniz crafted the following argument that explains the type of cause behind the existence of the universe. Premise 1. Every existing thing has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3. The universe exists. Premise 4. Therefore, the universe has an explanation for its existence. Premise 5. Therefore, the explanation for the universe's existence is God. Let's briefly retrace this very powerful argument for God's existence. Premise 1. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Everything, whether the universe, you, or God, has an explanation for why it exists. As Leibniz began to develop this argument, he noted two classifications of things that exist. First, there are those things that rely on a cause outside of themselves, or could have existed in a different way, or what we call contingent beings. For example, I before you did not have to exist. I could have had different features and required an external cause to account for my existence. Leibniz's second category deals with things which exist necessarily. That is, they must exist, and thus it is impossible for them not to exist. In addition, necessary existence entails that it could not have been any other way and exists by virtue of its own nature. Some mathematicians, for instance, believe numbers exist necessarily, since they could not have been any other way. Number 2, for instance, could not be 3 or 1. The next premise may cause some of you, maybe even Mr. Moore, to raise an eyebrow or two. Premise 2. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Some people will protest, and they'll accuse me of front-loading what I am trying to prove, God's existence, into the premise, thus admitting the dreaded fallacy of evading the question, i.e. circular reasoning. However, the reason why the second premise is immune from such accusations is because it is logically equivalent to what the non-theist might argue, namely, if God does not exist, then the universe has no explanation for its existence. But then why must the cause of the universe be God? And is the universe itself a necessary entity? Without going into too much detail, current astronomical evidence for both the expansion of the universe and the second law of thermodynamics support the notion of the universe having a beginning in the finite past, which means it was caused and thus is contingent. So why advocate God as its cause? We know it can't be another material cause, such as other universes or multiverses, since such causes would comprise an actually infinite chain of causes, which is impossible in the actual world. What about an abstract cause, like a number? The problem is that abstract objects, by definition, don't stand in causal relations to anything. For example, oh man, the number 2 made me spill my coffee. As an intelligent entity, God possesses the will and power to bring something like the universe into being. Thus, we move to the third premise. Premise 3, the universe exists. This is the simplest of the premises to understand, and one which I'm certain would be agreed upon by Mr. Moore and myself. Premise 4, there exists an explanation of the universe for its existence. As we've already shown, God is the only candidate who rightly fits the profile for the cause of the universe. Thus, from a consideration of the above 4 premises, the conclusion follows, therefore, the explanation for the universe's existence is God. With the 2 above arguments arguing for us to believe in a general sort of theism, my next argument will bridge us to Christian theism. Namely, God is the best explanation for the facts surrounding the empty tomb of Jesus. Now, in this next argument, I'll present what is called an inductive argument for Jesus' resurrection. For this sort of argument to work, it must be shown that the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is more probable than its naturalistic rivals. It may surprise some people that the resurrection of Jesus occupies as much of a place in historical investigation as it does in Christian faith. So what happened on that Easter morning? Let me first lay out a version of the argument and then comment on it. Premise 1. There are 4 main facts associated with the events of that first Easter morning. Jesus' honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of the empty tomb by Jesus' closest women followers, reported post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various people, and the disciples' dramatic shift from skepticism to faith. Premise 2. The hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead best explains these 4 facts. Premise 3. The proposal God raised Jesus from the dead entails the existence of the God of the Bible. Therefore, God exists. And how can we show that Christ's resurrection from the dead was a historical event? The following 4 points shows us how. First, we express the facts surrounding Jesus' empty tomb. A fact is a past event that is multiply attested in several sources, and which is viewed by most historians living today. Scholar Dr. Gary Habermas did a landmark study surveying over 2,000 publications by scholars of all stripes from 1975 to present, wherever there was 75% agreement that constituted a fact. Second, we must identify the primary sources for our historical investigation. Before there was a gathering together of such sources into the one we call the New Testament, they were independently written. The primary sources for Jesus, regarded by historians, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and some of Paul's epistles. It must be noted that people must not dismiss these sources due to their being quote-unquote in the Bible. Historians of all stripes regard these as the primary sources for Jesus' life, and so to do otherwise is without warrant. Although it is right for the Christian to see these documents as inerrant scripture, for the sake of this argument, I'm choosing to approach these documents as reliable sources, hence leaving the inerrancy discussion for another day. So as far as the four facts are concerned, we have a solid first premise. The third consideration for the historical case of Jesus' resurrection by considering all explanatory options. On the naturalistic side, there are what we call full tomb hypotheses. There are also what we call empty tomb hypotheses. And there are various schools of thought over the centuries that have marshaled various versions of these. All these hypotheses fit under the umbrella of naturalistic explanations, in contrast to the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead. The fourth way we study the historical event of the empty tomb is by subjecting it to standard criteria for historical investigation. Historian C.D. McCall, in his book Justifying Historical Descriptions, notes several criteria used by historians when assessing the best explanation for any event and its attendant facts. Criteria such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, least contrived, disconfirmed by few's already accepted beliefs, and which one outperforms its rivals for the other criteria. Any reason for rejecting the hypothesis offered by the disciples is never due to historical grounds, but rather philosophical objections. Stated differently, if someone presupposes the impossibility of miracles, then their conclusion will land on the naturalistic side. The divine explanation for the empty tomb has uniquely and consistently passed all the other. By considering what I have sketched, we then consider on the final premise of our argument the proposal, God raised Jesus from the dead, and therefore it entails his existence, and thus God exists. Which leads us to my fourth and final argument, that God of Christianity can be personally known and experienced. One noted philosopher has referred to knowledge of God as a properly basic belief. Such properly basic beliefs don't require us to justify why it is we are rational in holding them. For example, the fact that all of you before me are minds rather than androids or robots. Or the fact that the memories that I have of the past were not planted there 5 minutes ago are examples of properly basic beliefs. Arguments of God, though valuable, can only raise the probability of belief in God's existence. I became a Christian because God was apprehended by me in a moment of trust he initiated when I was a 10-year-old boy. For 35 years, I have known and experienced God as much as external reality and other people in my life. I will close with a quote from James in the New Testament, James 4:8. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yes.
Prehistoric humans viewed the world with a reverence for all that existed, but had no clue as to how everything came about. They used their innovation to create such items as artwork and tools, leading them to develop a connection between artifact and design. Anthropologist Max Mueller argued that since these humans they didn't make the celestial bodies, endless waters, and vast forests they encountered each day, they believed someone else had performed this task. It is here that they began flirting with what anthropologist Robert Merritt called the supernatural, which he defined as the attitude of mind dictated by awe and hysteria. They couldn't explain what caused many natural phenomena to occur, so they attributed them to unknown entities. A strong desire for safety influenced humans' behavior. While out gathering food, They would observe movement in the grass or hear noises in the forest nearby. They didn't know what this was, and fear compelled them to flee. If the source turned out to be a predator, they could be injured or killed if they remained there. So here we have our lack of knowledge of what's out there intermingling with our primary instinct to survive. We kept our distance from those things that might harm us. And the objects of our fear also inspired veneration. As we advanced our perceptions of the divine, some creatures took on mythical qualities. Artwork left by ancient society shows animals such as lions and eagles as beings that are worthy of praise and eventually worship. They are among the first documented images of deities. Edward Tyler, another anthropologist, concluded that early humans came to believe they experienced visions of deceased loved ones while they slept. Since they couldn't possibly grasp the notion of the subconscious or how dreams drew upon their memories, it makes sense that they interpreted these images as communications from somewhere beyond their own environment. Tyler wrote that having dreams contributed to forming the idea of the soul. To prepare those who traveled to this other realm, humans began placing useful objects with the bodies of deceased loved ones. This is among the first signs of evidence we have of humans engaging in rituals. These ceremonies demonstrated their desire to remain linked to their family members. Religious scholar Raza Aslan wrote that this is the aspect of burial that they believe in an afterlife. Otherwise, why put these items with the body? According to a story published February 26, 2012 by Psychology Today, theism satisfied people's need for security and control, justice for their suffering at the hands of others, and anxiety over their pending death. They felt better believing a wise, benevolent agent was looking after them, ready to put things right. Theism also offered easy answers. It allowed people to draw conclusions to problems without empirical evidence. Why was this crop destroyed by an unknown disease? Witchcraft. These facts provide a foundation for how religious thought began. With a mixture of admiration and dread, humans exalted that which they didn't understand while creating idols based on the natural wonders they encountered. This demonstrates a practice that humans have long followed, conceptualizing things we don't comprehend with items that are familiar to us. Divine beings took on the likeness of living creatures. Thoughts of the supernatural, therefore, are an extension of the natural. They developed into an ideology of wishful thinking. Even as our religious ideas grew more complex over time, this pattern of filling in the blanks with uncertainties has remained the same. We conclude there must be a supreme being because we cannot explain how the universe began or why our planet was able to sustain life. At this time, we do not know how it occurred. So it must be God, right? This answer is unsatisfactory because it relies on belief without evidence to resolve the most fundamental questions in life. There are numerous things we could explain many years ago, or could not explain many years ago, that now have perfectly reasonable answers through natural processes. Gravity is but one example. People used to believe that God literally pressed everything down toward Earth. But in his general theory of relativity, Albert Einstein showed that gravity is not a force, but rather a consequence of the curvature of space-time caused by the uneven distribution of mass. In addition, Galileo Galilei was sentenced to house arrest by the Roman Catholic Church after proving the Copernican theory that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. We understand a great deal more about the universe and our role in it than we used to. Yes, there are many things we haven't figured out, not yet anyway. There is much research to be conducted and many discoveries to be made. So to suggest that we've exhausted all possible options for how we came to be, leaving the act of being as the only viable answer, is premature. Theists tend to reject rational explanations to some existing problems because they have become so heavily invested in religion. Evolution by natural selection is a prime example of this. Humans have long pondered how we came to be the way we are. Because we didn't grasp how this occurred, we concluded there must be a supreme being doing this work behind the scenes. But now that we have a perfectly logical theory on what has taken place, We no longer have to cling to the notion that a deity carried out our development. Yet many theists fiercely deny the overwhelming evidence testifying to the truth of evolutionary science. This goes beyond the God must have done it reply, as that is based on the idea that we have no better explanation. Now that we have the best answer imaginable, why do many theists still insist this is the work of a divine hand? The notion of a deity is no longer just a presumption based on a lack of knowledge. It's an ideology that must be defended against what common sense tells us is the most reasonable explanation. As we've seen, supernatural has been the basis of virtually every society since prehistoric eras. Although people have rejected deities since humans first developed religious belief, the first known widespread attempts to promote non-belief occurred perhaps no longer than 3,000 years ago. Those who taught that the universe had natural rather than divine origins include Greek philosophers Epicurus and Democritus. Such efforts were vehemently opposed. For substantial periods of human history, theism has been the default worldview. While different cultures had their own set of beliefs, people just took for granted that divine characters existed. The rare choice to preach otherwise was usually met with scorn, derision, and contempt. In at least some societies, the act of denying the existence of any deities put its adherents in jeopardy of their lives. People have every incentive to accept the myths concerning gods, angels, and demons. Any hint of deviation from the popular narratives could spell trouble. There are legitimate questions about why theists defend their beliefs. Most people who remain religious into adulthood keep the ideas that they were taught as children. Our parents were liars, were they? This shows a strong relationship between what we learn when we're still very young and the need to adhere to some of these ideas as we grow older. In his book, Born Believers, psychologist Justin Barrett argues that religious faith isn't merely a consequence of indoctrination. He writes that babies begin connecting events they encounter with a higher authority because of the way our brains operate. As a practicing Christian, he asserts that theism is natural for humans and should not be rejected. But while we are hardwired to believe in divine beings, this doesn't mean they exist. Adults frequently reinforce to their children the need to stay faithful. Religious customs play a crucial role in rite of passage events in young people's lives, and this is a profound effect on how they perceive their authenticity. So how does all of this affect the manner in which we examine the possibility of supernatural phenomena? What does it say about the popular defenses of the theistic viewpoint? There has been no neutral environment in which to objectively study whether a supreme being created the universe and everything in it. This is not to suggest that no one has ever come to an independent conclusion that the supernatural realm exists. Obviously, many have. But the primary motivation behind denouncing non-belief has often been to protect these views. Many renowned apologists promote sophisticated defenses of religious doctrine to preserve the faith they had developed throughout their lives. They didn't put their beliefs aside to test whether or not they were true. Natural theology is one such example. Thomas Aquinas and William Paley are both associated with this hypothesis. They found in nature what they previously came to believe through lifelong religious instruction. This is called confirmation bias. Adherents tend to look for evidence that reflects their long-held ideas rather than adopt a neutral position on its credibility. Some proponents distort scientific facts to perpetuate suspicions about the idea of a universe with no creator or designer. Investigations into whether or not something is true demand the ability to scrutinize it as objectively as possible. This requires individuals willing to accept the conclusions they draw either way. The only stake they should have in the result is the advancement of truth. Most cultures do not foster an environment for this kind of dispassionate research. From the time they are babies, many humans are taught that they have a soul, that a supreme being created everything, and that they will move on to a new realm once they die. It can be incredibly difficult to dismiss notions we've held dear throughout our lives, and depending on the traditions in which they were raised, there's usually a good reason for people to remain in the faith. Fear of the unknown proves very effective in keeping people aligned with the status quo. So how has religion survived for so long despite its many flaws? Why do people continue to accept it even though its foundation is ignorance and fear? Don Hewitt, the longtime executive producer of the CBS news program 60 Minutes, was periodically asked how the show became so successful. He always responded that it was a simple formula summarized in 4 words: tell me a story. By this he meant that people love stories and want to listen to ones that are well crafted. News reporting can get dull if the only objective is to relate facts. Hewitt, in his career at 60 Minutes, understood that if facts were woven into a compelling narrative, viewers would be more willing to pay attention and trust the information. And for more than 50 years now, they've returned to watch the program week after week. This explains why theism has persisted for more than 100,000 years. What grips people the most are the stories told. His tales that make up some of the finest works of literature. They allow us to imagine what we've long prayed and religion has always promised: a better life than one we have. Scholar Joseph Campbell studied myths and their relevance to our lives. He declared that by serving as metaphors, myths help people spiritually and enrich cultures. People, however, erroneously believe that religious writers from antiquity relay facts rather than present metaphors. They reject the notion that the purpose of these sacred documents may not be to chart historical events. One of my religion professors in college often compared true stories to truth stories in the Bible. True stories depict historical events. They document, quite simply, incidents that have a basis in reality. Truth stories, on the other hand, convey a meaningful lesson about life. We cherish them not because they chronicle things that actually occurred, but for the timeless messages they impart. We need to do a better job of distinguishing between the two. Thank you.
That's the initial presentation, delivered in a hurry. We won't have time to slow down and ask some questions in a while. But right now, each of these fellows is going to have 8 minutes to rebut what he just heard. And then, if you wish to start, whenever you're ready.
Mr. Moore's presentation, I identified 3 main arguments that he brought forth for non-theism. The first argument is what we could call an argument for religion from evolutionary psychology of religion. And this is a theory that basically says that the origin of religious belief derives as a result of evolutionary development and cognitive brain theory. Now, as he opened up this first argument for non-theism, he basically said that theism is a byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning, based on the conclusions of those in the field of evolutionary philosophy of religion. Mr. Moore's opening remarks state, prehistoric humans viewed their world with a reverence for all that existed, but had no clue as to how everything came about. This demonstrates a practice that humans have long followed, conceptualizing things we don't comprehend with items that are familiar to us. Divine beings took on the likeness of living creatures. Thoughts of the supernatural, therefore, are an extension of the natural. They developed into an ideology of wishful thinking. And of course, he presented cave paintings, remains, and rituals. Now, it's very important that when we're dealing with evidence, that we also understand that there are explanations for the evidence. In other words, the evidence doesn't come with tags that tells you who put it there or why. And so what we're concerned about with tonight is, well, which is the best explanation for the evidence? Is it theism or non-theism? Well, let's just say if we were to grant the assumptions of biological evolution and neo-Darwinian theory. Kim Sterling, a professor of philosophy, writes in the book The First 4 Billion Years of Evolution from Harvard University Press. Here's what she has to say. Quote, "To what extent is our ordinary common sense picture of ourselves and our world compatible with the evolutionary account? Common sense views of humans as agents, namely that we are self-aware, that we are decision makers, we make real choices, we're reflective, we're often rational, aware of moral considerations, and sometimes responsive to them. Perhaps this picture is undermined by an evolutionary perspective that sees us as self-replicating machines, as vehicles built by and for genes. What choice would there be? Morality would be an illusion." In other words, let's just say if we developed as a result of natural selection and gene mutation, our very beliefs about something such as the world came about by naturalism, we could no more discern that to be true than anything else, because evolution is not concerned with truth. Rather, evolution is concerned with survival of the fittest. And thus, even our own beliefs, we would never be able to tell what is true from what is not true. And so this idea of religion evolving or coming as a result of some adaptation to biological evolution, it does not deal in the realm of truth. And that's exactly the kind of realm which Mr. Moore tries to advocate. So as we can see, the argument for religion from evolution falls short. Then there's a second argument that he marshaled, namely that science and reason explain the world's origins. He quoted Democritus, "Nothing exists except atoms and empty space. Everything else is an opinion." Now, the argument that I presented tonight, namely what accounts for the cause of the universe, deals with that if anything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either by virtue of its own nature or by an external cause. So the question is, what caused the universe? Now, astrophysical evidence, for example, tells us that the universe did have a beginning in the finite past. We also know from the second law of thermodynamics that all usable energy in a closed system will eventually run out, which tells us that there's an arrow to time, that there is a beginning to all the physical universe. So the question is, what caused our physical universe? Was it a material cause or an immaterial cause? If it would have been a material cause, then the question would have been what would have caused that material cause? And you would have an infinite chain of causes going all the way back into the eternal past. But we know scientific evidence tells us that there is but a finite beginning to the universe. Now, there is an argument that I did not present tonight, but it goes something like this. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, anything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. From our current understanding of scientific theory, as well as philosophical considerations, namely that an actual infinite is not possible in reality, it only makes sense to say that the universe had a beginning. Now, if indeed the universe had a beginning, which we know that it did, then the question is, well, would the cause have been material or immaterial? From what we understand, since it couldn't have been another material cause, then it would have to be an immaterial cause. It would have to be a cause that was timeless, spaceless, immaterial, extremely powerful. Furthermore, for this cause to bring about a finite effect, namely the universe, it had to possess a will. It had to make a choice. And thus, that would give us God. Then there's a third argument which he brings out, which has to do with our beliefs themselves. Now, I had already ended with this one, namely that you can know God by personal experience. As I already mentioned, knowledge of God is what we could call a properly basic belief. Now, if you'll recall, a properly basic belief is a belief that is rational to hold to apart from evidence. Matter of fact, Dr. Wishelms made this distinction earlier at the beginning of tonight's debate. He talked about what's called a posteriori beliefs, namely those types of beliefs that we arrive at by experience, versus a priori beliefs, namely those beliefs that are innate. And so we understand that there are certain kinds of beliefs that we can hold to, and yet we don't have any evidence for them. Like, for example, how do I know that all of you are not androids? How do I know that you have your own private beliefs, your own private memories? Or how do I know that the food that I had memory of eating, was not some memory that was implanted by someone else? You see, we all operate on a daily basis by certain beliefs without evidence, and yet they're rational to hold to. And I would say to you that belief in God constitutes a properly basic belief. Now, when we see these things that Mr. Moore showed tonight, how can we account for them? Well, we understand that Scripture tells us that man was created in the image of God. And that simply means he was given the capacity to be able to relate to God. The idea that mankind has religious knowledge, the fact that it's virtually universal all over the globe, most certainly it makes much more sense to account for the fact that there was an all-powerful, all-knowing Creator that created mankind in His image. Thank you.
I spent the weekend learning PowerPoint, so I'm a demon in it now. Thank you. Oops. No. Not working on it. In defending theism, Reverend Smith said objective moral values are the same everywhere, every time, independent of personal opinion or feeling. They autonomously dictate what is right and wrong, so they must come from God. However, objective values is an oxymoron. According to Merriam-Webster, people exhibit objectivity when dealing with facts or conditions as perceived without distortion by personal feelings, prejudices, or interpretations. On the other hand, we assign value to something that's of, quote, relative worth, utility, or importance, the dictionary tells us. Value depends on what an item means to me, not anyone else. Reverend Smith spoke of a moral law. And how do our consciences tell us that we're violated a moral edict? We feel guilty. Examining the word moral.
Jerry, you've lost power here. We'll take a break.
I can use this one. Okay. This working now? Okay. Examining the origins of the word moral, one of its roots in Latin is the term moralis. This means the, quote, proper behavior of a person in society, according to the online etymology dictionary. The appropriate Merriam-Webster definition of society in this instance would be a segment of the community that, that people express differing views on moral tenets shows they are not universal, and how morals have changed over time proves they are not absolute. Morals stem from the basic human instinct to survive. We evolved into a highly intelligent and emotional species. Cooperation gives us an advantage over rivals. Through socialization, we develop strong bonds of affection for one another. Here's an objective fact. Injuring another person physically or emotionally causes pain. The foundation for all morals is that humans don't wish to be harmed. And the empathy we feel for others means we don't want them to be harmed either. We need no independent lawgiver to grasp this truth. Morals, therefore, are subjective constructions that make relationships work. Other species of animals empathize with each other and enforce rules of conduct. It's a purely naturalistic process. There's a good reason many people develop similar morals. We're all human and made of the same stuff. We think very much alike, we feel very much alike, and we behave very much alike. At the heart of our morality is the love and compassion we feel for others. Trying to separate this desire for justice from the primal emotions is futile. If there's no connection, how could we explain righteous indignation or moral outrage? Reverend Smith referenced a quote by C.S. Lewis. It goes, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." Interestingly, this actually lends credence to my argument. Any astrophysicist will tell you that our perception of a straight line is simply that, a perception. Due to the curvature of space-time, there is no such thing as a straight line. And just as the straight line is merely our perception, so is our view of moral. This discussion is recognized as recent as Reverend Smith's second. He cited Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in declaring that everything has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an internal cause. Where the universe came from has puzzled humans forever. Repeating a point made in my opening remarks, many people look to God as the source because they don't know how else to explain it. They believe a solely material origin would be like something out of Seinfeld, go about nothing. As it turns out, we have a very Seinfeldian universe, but not in how critics may suspect. Just as Jerry Seinfeld knew his program was not about nothing, a non-divinely created cosmos did not come from nothing. Numerous scientists have theorized that the Big Bang didn't originate everything. Research shows there may have been some material essence that existed beforehand and produced our universe. Reverend Smith talked about how the second law of thermodynamics supports the universe being in a finite past and having a cause. He also said an infinite chain of material causes would be impossible. But physicists reported in 2016 that they found a loophole in this law of physics, so it's not set in stone. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding the universe. There is much yet for us to learn. Just as we conclude that something all had worked out, another discovery will pose a new challenge. This is the nature of science. Albert Einstein turned the field of theoretical physics on its head by proving time was relative. Virtually everyone viewed time as an absolute that never altered, a cosmic clock perpetually moving forward. But time actually slows as matter approaches the speed of light. So if I turn on a flashlight, alternate realities occur simultaneously. From our perspective, we can measure the speed and distance traveled by the particles of light. But from their perspective, time has stopped passing. Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland argues that a cosmic entity giving rise to our universe couldn't have existed forever. This is because something running through time for infinity could never reach the instance of the Big Bang. It has no starting point, so it would take forever to arrive at a designated moment. But this presumes the passage of time as we experience it. Just as I demonstrated, things throughout the universe gauge time differently. It's possible that time didn't exist until the beginning of this universe, so the cosmic entity preceding ours may not have traveled from an infinite moment in the past. Subatomic particles behave in ways that could be described as miraculous. Quantum mechanics will surely answer many of our questions of how everything started. Given the uncertainty of how these particles behave, there's no telling where ongoing research will lead. Crediting God with creating the universe, therefore, is premature. We haven't come close to exhausting all other options.
Well, as I attempt to draw tonight's debate to a conclusion concerning theism, I wanted to interact with what Jerry had just said, as well as to comment on how he had interacted with my arguments. In tonight's debate, I made the contention that theism better explains the experiences of humanity and the overall aspects of reality. I contended that we should believe Christian theism, since it best explains reality and human experience, and secondly, we should doubt non-theism, since it lacks comparable arguments to explain such aspects. The first argument I presented was the moral argument. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. 2, objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. Now, Mr. Moore said that objectivity is something that human beings value. Furthermore, morals have to do with human flourishing. And so, I suppose maybe this is a question that I could raise when we have our little dialogue after this. But what would have happened if human beings had not existed? Would such morals be valid? For example, would the Nazis and what they had done to the Jews, would that be considered evil? Are moral values objective just only because human beings exist? What happens to other species, baboons or insects? Do they have their own versions of morality? No, when I say that morality is objective, I'm talking about that there are objective moral values, right and wrong, apart from values that we place upon them, or whether or not we exist or not. Secondly, I argued for how God is the best explanation for why the universe exists. And again, this was based upon the principle of sufficient reason, namely that everything has an explanation for its existence, whether it be by the necessity of its nature or by an external cause. Now, the universe is a physical reality. And, as I had already argued, there cannot be such things as actual infinites. For example, the number of seconds in the universe could not extend back infinitely into time. Otherwise, we would never have arrived here at this very moment. Furthermore, the idea that there are an infinite chain of material causes, scientific evidence, as a majority rule, just rules that out. In 2003, there were 3 physicists, Arvin Board, Guth, and Vilenkin, and basically what they proposed was that a universe that on average in its history is in a rate of cosmic expansion had to have a beginning. And so that particular theorem describes our universe, and therefore the universe had a beginning. It could not a disembodied mind. Offered for Jesus' empty tomb concerning the 4 facts that I had mentioned, the hypothesis that God was the best explanation for the empty tomb. Now, what we've seen here tonight is that Mr. Moore is a naturalist, which basically asserts that all that exists is physical reality. And so as this argument states, the best explanation for the empty tomb is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And this is how you get from general theism to Christian theism. And so he did not address that. Concerning my final argument, namely that the God of Christianity can be personally known and experienced. Again, as I argued, belief in God is what we call a properly basic belief. Such properly basic beliefs don't require evidence to justify why it is we are rational in holding to them. Arguments for God, though valuable, can only raise the probability of belief in God's existence. However, they cannot deliver a personal experience of God. And God desires you to know Him in a personal relationship. So, what we're talking about here tonight is 2 things. What I've presented to you is, number 1, showing that God exists, showing how He exists, and then number 2, how you can know Him by personal experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Smith presents God's existence as the only explanation for Jesus' resurrection, and he uses biblical accounts to confirm the empty tomb. But narratives of God's dying and being resurrected were common in antiquity. This passage comes from The Golden Bough by James George Fraser. But when night had fallen, the sorrow of the worshippers was turned to joy, for suddenly a light shone in the darkness. The tomb was opened. The God had risen from the dead. And as the priest touched the lips of the weeping mourners with balm, he softly whispered in their ears the glad tidings of salvation. The resurrection of the God was hailed by his disciples as a promise that they too would issue triumphant from the corruption of the grave. This describes the resurrection of the Phrygian god Attis, whose cult began around 1250 BC. Dying and rising god myths are also told of the Mesopotamian deity Tammuz and the Greek god Adonis. Cultures often borrowed each other's myths to expand on their own stories, and there's no doubt Christians did this as well. Reverend Smith said God's existence can be known by the personal experiences that he and other people have had. Of course, the same can be said of people who practice other religions. Have you ever witnessed the devotion that Hare Krishnas pay to their God? And any one of them will tell you that their experience is very real. But many religions proclaim exclusive truths, so they can't all be correct. Belief systems are known to falsely produce the sensation of being in a divine presence. And if most of them do this, why shouldn't we suspect that all of them can? The strongest argument against theism, actually, is events like this debate. If a supreme being truly existed, particularly the one described in the Judeo-Christian Bible, why would such great efforts be needed to persuade others that this was true? Is there an entire field of apologetics necessary to convince us that Reverend Smith exists? No, he's right here in our midst. Theism describes our wishes rather than our reality. We don't understand the world around us and take comfort in the certainty that it has a purpose. We fear death and want to live forever. We grow weary of the limits of this life and desire a realm where all our dreams are fulfilled. Humans have always envisioned divine beings as enhanced versions of earthly creatures. We portray the Judeo-Christian God as a man, actually as a superman. Theism, therefore, paints a picture not of what's really out there, but rather that which we'd like to become. In closing, I'd like to express my appreciation to Reverend Smith for inviting me to participate in this forum, and for the Reverend Dr. Wilchelms for moderating it. We're indebted to Jefferson Community College for hosting this event, and to all the JC staff members who made sure we had everything we needed. Most importantly, I'm grateful to all of you for attending this event, and we hope you found it engaging. Thank you very much. Well, I'm interested in some of the issues I've raised about what we know about the universe and the world around us and what we don't know. And I guess I'm curious why theists jump to the conclusion, well, it must be a God, when there's so much we still don't understand about the universe and how it began and what preceded it.
Okay. So your question is, oh.
Is his mic in?
Maybe you want to repeat that again?
My question was, given the fact that we understand that there's a lot that we don't know yet about the universe, about the world we live in, about ourselves. How can theists jump to the conclusion, well, it must have been God who created all of this, when we see that there's still quite a bit to be discovered about that?
Sure. Recently, I heard someone giving a lecture on what we know versus what there is to still know. And what the speaker did, he drew a big circle, which represents all that there could be possible to know. And then he drew a smaller circle within that bigger circle, which represents what we know. And he showed how what we know versus what there is to know, there's quite a bit of difference. So my response to that would be a couple things. First and foremost, indeed, there's a lot that we don't know. However, to say that theists jump to the conclusion, well, God did it, implies that in our physical universe, there is no way that we can infer the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing God. And yet, whenever, like with what the arguments that I presented tonight, and that was only a sampling. I mean, philosophers will tell you that there's in the neighborhood of some 24 different arguments for God's existence. All of them appeal to various features of our physical world, various features of common everyday human experience. One example I could point to would be the existence of human consciousness. The fact that there's a distinction to be made between the brain and the mind. And I would suggest that the mind is immaterial. Brains don't feel. Brains don't have a will, but a mind does. So the fact that there is a thing called a mind that has distinct characteristics from the brain would indicate to us that that is an immaterial reality. So I would say that in terms of what we know about our world, it doesn't rule out theism. If anything, theism has as much, if not more, explanatory power than non-theism. So theists do not just jump to the automatic conclusion that God did it. What we do, like the premises that I offered tonight, whenever you're offering an argument, you must ask yourself, all right, are these premises sound? And then, are they valid? And then you offer the evidence for each of those premises. So the evidence that I offered tonight would show that theism is more probable than non-theism. And so I would ask that out of all those arguments that I offered, if you could show which one of those premises with which you had a problem and then offer your own, that would be the only way in which you could legitimately say that non-theism is more probable than theism. Yeah.
Is that a question you're asking of him? That last statement you made?
Mahlon?
About what? Oh, concerning the premises, or?
That he did not respond to that. What would his response be to that statement? Let him answer that.
Okay.
Well, I would say that some of your, as I pointed out in my rebuttal, some of your premises are flawed. You said that there must have been a finite past to the universe. Yes, there must have been a finite past to this universe. But as I pointed out, there's still so much about existence that we don't understand. And we can't, how can you rule out, well, there was some essence that existed that had a creative power, not necessarily a mind or a will, but just something that created our universe. How we don't understand, there's so much we don't understand about the universe that I don't know how you can say, well, then the idea of theism is sound because of this, and this. Well, it's not, because we don't understand those yet. How I don't see how theists can jump to that conclusion that it must be God, because there's still so much we don't understand and don't comprehend about what caused this. You understand what I mean?
Okay. Oh. All right, when someone's got a squeaky shoe.
No, rather the God that I'm defending tonight is the God who is self-existent, who's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, uncreated time and spaces, immaterial. So as I look at the astrophysical evidence,
just one, but it's something, somebody in here has something that's messing with every single microphone.
that's how a theist begins to argue the case as to why we believe that God is the best explanation for the world we see around us, as well as our own daily human experience.
I'll just make the point that maybe the notion that something can come out of nothing that's not true. It's actually not. Quantum mechanics, things pop out of nothing all the time. One, once again, I think what the point is, that we know a lot about the one more than we ever have. And we also have an understanding of those things that we don't do. And the thing about time, what I said in my thought was that, yes, the time as we experience it, we can effectively apply it. But if there is something, there's matter that doesn't experience it, time stands still. It's motion that moving at the same time. Time doesn't pass. If you have an essence that exists before that, where time is not passing, you would not have the problem of this going back to a point. So, there's, once again, I think if I don't know these things, there's a lot of discoveries to be made. So,
That's red. Which is 2.
All right, we're open for some questions now. Okay, I saw 2 hands. One in the back in the big shirt. Second, third. You're gonna have to shout it out.
Okay. I have a question for each of you. Pastor Mahlon, is there evidence for theism in the absence of religiosity?
When you say religiosity, what do you mean?
Without having to define it by religion, probably general theism. Is there evidence for that without having to define it through the lens of religion?
Well, if you'll note the first 2 arguments that I presented tonight, they come from what is called natural theology. Natural theology considers evidence for God's existence apart from divine written revelation. So I would say, yes, we can infer God's existence from considerations of the physical world, considerations of our internal makeup, considerations of philosophy. The third argument that I presented is a historical argument for Jesus' resurrection. And so what it does, it considers the sources of the Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters. Now, in the argument, I made this important point. It's not treating those documents as authoritative, inerrant documents, as Christians, as I said, rightly ought to. And that's a discussion for another day. Instead, whenever you say you were to take a class in New Testament studies at a university, or if you were to listen to a lecture by New Testament historians, they would approach those documents from the standpoint of them being reliable sources. And so that particular argument deals with the evidence for Jesus in platoon. And the question is, what is the best explanation for them? Now, the only argument which dealt with religiosity, as you say, is the fourth. But I would say, yes, you can arrive at a knowledge about God, apart from religious considerations. And then, as I would argue, God can be known personally by experience, which I would argue would be as a result of faith and trust in God as revealed in Jesus Christ.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, you had said that we have a lot to learn. We have so much more that we're learning about the universe and atoms and particle physics, and I'm assuming you're talking about that. In that sense, do you feel like as we learn, one of those options could be intelligent design? That's my first question. The second is, do you feel as a naturalist that empiricism in itself limits us?
We could. It's possible that in our discovery we could come across more evidence that the universe came about by design. but we haven't arrived at that point yet. So, and what was your second question? I'm sorry.
Do you think we will ultimately arrive at that point? And do you feel like that, admittedly, that one of those options might be theism?
Like I said, it could. But we haven't gotten there. And I don't know. I mean, there's always, science will tell you that nothing is ever settled. There's always more questions to ask. There's always more tests to do, more things to ponder. And I think that we're jumping to conclusions about theism. I mean, we did this 100,000 years ago, and I can't say that they really got it right. And based on the fact that theism to them was, well, something is shaking the tree, so it must be some divine presence. Well, now we know what that is. It's a climactic condition. It causes wind. There's so many things that we understand about the natural world that we didn't 100,000 years ago. So we have to say there's many more discoveries to be made, and could be we come to the point that theism is at, but I don't think we've arrived there yet, and I don't think that's.
Stephen Hawking had said in his conferences that as a scientist and a physicist, that you would have to be, if you were entirely objective, you would have to say that at this point, there is far more evidence for intelligent design at this point than there is for not having intelligent design. Do you feel that being the empirical beings that we are, that empiricism at itself limits us, that we are only going to be able to perceive empirically to a certain degree, that there's not something that is beyond empirical study?
It could be. I'm not certain that that's the point. That understanding Stephen Hawking's mindset, I don't think he would agree that the intelligent design was. So I don't know if that's the point he was trying to make.
State that there was more evidence for design.
But I'm certain that he also believed that what evidence was against it would prevail. He was an atheist and committed to it.
So my question is sort of things aside. So you say that because there's God, there's morals, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How did you learn your personal morals that you believe in God?
Okay. And I think the question is, how did I come about my... Okay, sure.
Did you learn in your household from someone else about church, about God? You learned from someone, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm assuming you're against abortion. It's not an abortion question. So in turn, you're against killing, say, 2 years.
Right.
So if you look around the world, you have so many societies. For example, Ugandan tribes who believe in Minji, where they believe that it is morally okay and acceptable to kill a child as soon as they're born by drowning them because they were born out of wedlock, the leaders didn't bless the pregnancy, or if the child's top teeth coming before the bottom. If you look in Saudi Arabia, you have people that get murdered and they believe that their stuff is okay. If there is a God, and consequently because of that, there is this moral set of laws, how can you explain the variety of acceptable morals when in argument, because of how things are around the world, morals, values, and social norms are created in society? How do you
Well, I think there's an important distinction to be made here. How we arrive at our understanding of morals, which we call moral epistemology, versus what grounds those standards of right and wrong, good and bad, which we call moral ontology. In my argument tonight, I was advocating what grounds objective right and wrong, good and bad. There are some things that everyone, everywhere, at any time would say is definitely good and definitely evil. Okay. For example, is it objectively wrong anytime and anywhere to take an automatic weapon into a school of elementary age children and mow them down with that automatic weapon. Is that evil?
So you're talking about murder.
Right. But is no. And again, you got to make the distinction between moral ontology, the grounding for objective moral values and duties, versus how we come about those things. So in assessing my example there, or again, when the Nazis, when they did what they did to the Jews in the Holocaust, now they themselves believed that they were doing right because they were just doing what they were told to do. And yet, they were regarded as that we discover. It's a lot like the physical laws in our universe. The law of gravitation, for example. Isaac Newton, when he came to his conclusions that he did, it wasn't like everything was floating around without gravity before Newton came about. No, rather he discovered gravity. When Einstein, later on in the 20th century, when he wrote what he wrote about gravity, again, he discovered the fact that space and time itself act as a fabric that responds to mass. So moral values and duties operate in the same way.
Really quick, lastly, you mentioned gravity and laws. So you would say that the second law of thermodynamics states that everything will eventually run out, which is not true. It actually is that in all energy exchanges, if no energy enters or leaves the system, the potential energy at stake will always be the amount that leaves the state. It's not going anywhere. It's not running out. It's not leaving or entering.
Well, may I respectfully correct you? I did not say that. Well, let me. I did not say in my speech that all energy will run out. No, I said that all usable energy will be exchanged for, say, in a system. If I have a gas-powered automobile, when I apply the brakes, that's friction. All that usable energy is being transferred into another form of energy, namely heat. So understanding then that the second law of thermodynamics tells us that the universe, when it began, was in a highly ordered state at a maximal value of order.
455 years none of the documents never talked about, none of these documents were around. They're all anonymous source gospels. The names were added later by scribe. And none of these people were eyewitnesses. It's also a common practice in ancient times to have a known story of the time. In fact, it's even considered meritorious to tell a story to make it more interesting. And the Gospels contradict each other in that respect, including in certain respects of the resurrection story. In one where the Gospel ends with resurrection that appears on one day, and then Jesus says, then in Acts, considered to be written by Luke, he says Jesus appears on earth for 40 days and appears for them in a week. So we've got fundamental contradictions. You're working partly your premise in this review, the purpose of the premise of these documents are accurate historical sources, and maybe accurate historical theological sources to make points about theology. You call them accurate historical sources, and really contradicted by the nature of the data. All right, let me
try to comment, and if I need to ask you about, because you raised 4 issues, all right, so I may need to ask you to remind me what they are. The first issue has to do with the claim that concerning the nature of nothing, and that this idea of a quantum field and how literally nothing can, or something can pop out of nothing because virtual particles pop out of a quantum field. Understand that the word nothing is a statement of universal negation. It literally means no thing. When we look at a quantum field is a whirling sea of energy where virtual particles are popping. Stephen Hawking's writings. He talked, for instance, about how at a black hole where quantum-like features can exist. He talked about what was called Hawking radiation. And let's say, for example, if I was to have a photon that was to go near the event horizon of a black hole, there would be a corresponding photon that would pop out of that. So the idea of a quantum system as being nothing is actually a fallacious statement because it's something. Nothing is nothing. If, on the other hand, we have a quantum system, it represents a physical regime in which subatomic particles are coming in and out. So it's not nothing, it's something. And then what was the second statement? Remind me, please. About the nature of time. The nature of time. According to quantum physics, I think even according to relativity, didn't exist prior to the Big Bang, which right. Of course comes out of singularity. Mm-hmm. None of the sure. Physics theoretically apply. Right. Well, and that's exactly the point of theism. At the point of singularity, all the 4 fundamental forces of nature, which would be the weak force, the strong force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. At the point of singularity, those 4 fundamental forces break down. By definition, that's where science stops. That's where we would say nature stops. And so at that point then, the question is, what accounts for the beginning of all that? The fact that the time itself had its beginning at that singularity, that's no problem for theism, because a God who is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, possessing a will, that's no problem for him. So I don't see how that objection would do away with theism. If anything, I think that definitely tips the hand in favor of theism, because it shows that if the universe had a beginning, and therefore if it could not have had a natural cause, then that tells us that it had to have been a supernatural cause. All right, what's your third statement? Right. Right. Sure. A God of the gaps argument is basically an argument argument that basically it says that, well, if I don't know such and such, then I'm just going to advocate God with no evidence. But yet the arguments that I presented tonight, they consider features of our world or our everyday human experience that we already do know. For example, in the second argument that I presented, namely that God is the best explanation for why anything exists, that is based upon a philosophical principle called the principle of sufficient reason, which basically says there must be an explanation for anything. There must be something to account for it. So, for example, if you come into the kitchen at my house, and if there's a pot of boiling water on the stove, there's a couple of ways you can explain that. You could either explain that as the result of the water molecules rubbing together faster and faster and faster until they boil. That would be a good physical scientific explanation. Or you could also say that Mahlon must have turned on the stove to get the water boiling. That would evoke an agent. In theistic arguments, all we're saying is that all of the physical processes in the world, as well as our common day, everyday human experience, can be explained as the result of an intelligent agent bringing them about.
That's an example of Aristotle's first cause, final cause.
Yes, sir.
There was a question over there, and then in the brown.
Yep. So I recall So I recall you claiming to defend a conception of theism that taught an all good and all powerful God. Most of us would agree that all good and all powerful God would want the best for us and want a world without pain, maximizing the good in the world. So then you have these painful diseases that apparently will never stop, but yet we stop in medicine. And so my assertion is that because God has not stopped those painful diseases that we have, that leaves one to complete A, God is unwilling to stop those painful diseases, or B, we are more powerful than God. So I think just what are your thoughts on that?
Let me begin by noting there's an underlying assumption in your question, namely that God would prefer to have a world that has no pain, no suffering, nothing of that sort. And my response to that would be, that's not obvious, for two reasons. First, we have a world which included a crucifixion, and as a Christian, I would argue an incarnation. And so the Son of God came into this world. He incarnated himself as a human being. He chose to undergo all of the common, everyday sort of human experiences we go through, as well as being rejected, and then to die and to be crucified. So since that world, which is what we live in, has that, included an incarnation, included a crucifixion, that tells me then that God did not prefer to create a world that had no evil or suffering. Secondly, the fact that God chose to create a world that includes free will persons such as ourselves. Now, God had a number of options. He could have chosen to create a world where everybody would love him, everybody would believe on him. But there's a problem with that. People are not loving or choosing God. Love, in order for me to love somebody, it has to be a choice. So God chose to create a world that was populated by free will beings such as ourselves. And in doing so, that would mean then that he would create a world in which he would permit a certain level of evil and suffering. What is God's point and purpose? God's point and purpose is that people would come to know him personally. God is not interested in us just knowing that he exists. No, God wants us to know him personally. And how is it that you develop a relationship with somebody? Well, you've got to gain their trust. And so there seems to be this optimal balance between situational evil, natural evil, moral evil, and goodness. And so God has created this optimal balance whereby he is hidden sufficiently enough from people that don't want to know him. And he also makes himself sufficiently known enough to those persons who do want to know him. So I would say to you then that the underlying premise that God preferred a world without evil and suffering is a misplaced premise. This is not the best of all possible worlds. However, I would suggest this is a world that points to what could be a best possible world, which is yet to come.
In other words, you are saying that God is not all good.
No, I didn't say that.
What are you defining as good?
Well, God is the standard of goodness because he himself is good. You're referring to the old supposed Euthyphro dilemma, which says that either what is good is what God wills to be good, or that so that would mean then that God just arbitrarily chooses what's good and stuff like that, or whatever is good is good outside of God. So there's a standard outside and apart from God. But I would offer to you a third alternative, namely, what is good is because God is good. In other words, all the standards of goodness reside in God because he by nature is good.
Put on the brown plaid shirt, and then you, sir, your second.
I have two questions. My first is the Bible states about animals. That Adam was given power by God to name the animals. He talks about cows. He talks about other animals. But dinosaurs are never talked about in the Bible. So also, the United States is also not talked about in the Bible. We talk about Europe. We talk about Asia. We talk about Persia. We talk about other places on the Eastern Hemisphere. They even talk about North and South of us, but they don't really talk about the United States like in the Bible. And then my second question was, no living God.
We didn't hear that yet.
No living God. I was born and soon, or later on, I will die eventual death. People have come back from the dead and told stories about heaven, or their version of heaven. Now, we know from the Bible that we have stories about heaven, about the pearly gates, about rivers of pearls, streets of gold, and mansions, right? How can you explain that empirically, or how can you explain that religiously in such a sense that a person can understand and maybe accept one reality or the other?
Who are you addressing the question to?
These questions are for both.
Okay. Jerry, you want to take that first? Yeah, I would say the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible is a very nice story. It's not true. Sorry. I was saying the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible is a very nice story, but it's not true. There's other cultures have had very similar and sometimes very different creation stories. This is what cultures do. They create stories that explain their origins. When you say people came back from the dead, I don't know that we can ascertain beyond any doubt that they were dead.
First and foremost, I would say that one could argue that the possibility of dinosaurs being in the Bible. If you turn to Job 38 and 39, there are two animals that God refers to. The one is called Behemoth, which is the strongest of the land animals. And then there's what we call Leviathan, which was the strongest of the seafaring animals. And God compared himself to those beasts. And in the Hebrew language, the word behemoth could be legitimately translated somewhat like of a sauropod animal, which would be likened unto, say, a brachiosaurus. And in like manner, the Hebrew word that's translated Leviathan could very well be legitimately translated somewhat like a plesiosaur. So I would say that indirectly speaking, I think you could argue for dinosaurs being mentioned in the Bible. Now, concerning the fact that the United States is not mentioned in the Bible, of course it's not. However, we got to understand that the United States came as a direct result of Europe, people migrating from Europe, and we do know that the European nations, especially the nations to the north like Russia and so on, were mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, whenever you read about the ancient nations that were called Meshach and Tubal. Whenever you read in Genesis chapter 10, we see there what's called the Table of the Nations. And originally there were 70 such nations that were mentioned. Of course, all those older nations and older names, of course, they would have changed since that time. However, when you trace the genetic and the geographical distributions of populations, they'll roughly correspond to those things. So that doesn't really present a problem concerning the fact that the United States specifically is not mentioned in the Bible. Then what about life after death? Of course, what we call AEDs, life after death experiences. I tend to place very minimal value on such experiences. Do I think that it's possible that someone could have, say, an out-of-body experience, say they're on an operating table and they momentarily not only lose consciousness, but their brain functions cease, and then they come back. Do I believe that's a possibility? I do believe that's a possibility. I would say that that gives us an indirect evidence for the reality of life after death. However, I don't normally appeal to those instances for the simple fact when people are having such experiences, you are going to have a variety of details and so on and so forth. So for that reason, I don't personally appeal to life after death experiences and making an overall case for theism. I would rather point to the empty tomb, which was my third argument in tonight's debate. And I would argue that the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation for that. I would say that since that is a historically verifiable fact, that is more probable than naturalistic explanations, the resurrection of Jesus gives us the best evidence for the reality of the afterlife, because it verified what Jesus taught about the afterlife, and he himself demonstrated such.
This is for Mr. Moore. Reverend Smith spoke about 10 years old, I believe it was, coming to his beliefs. And I'm just wondering what led you to your beliefs?
I was raised in a religious home as well. I'm originally from the Chicago area, and I was raised Roman Catholic and remained very religious throughout most of my life. But I found that the experience of trying to communicate with God was just completely empty, despite how much I tried. I kind of came to the conclusion that trying to communicate with God, trying to pray to God, I always had this vision of this giant empty room with a table that had a fax on it, and there were just like billions of faxes lying around, not touched. And I think once you begin to even allow yourself to consider a universe without God, without a designer, without a creator, a lot of things make sense. And so then that's, so far about the past decade, I've adopted that, and it just seems to make more sense to me than theism.
A lot of people discuss science, and it might be so many years ago back in the question came up with Albert Einstein, and I wanted to get one summary
I'm kind of curious, I understand that's a historical issue. Can you explain or tell us about how many individuals that charged Jesus after the resurrection? How many instances were there over what course of time? What did you about the book of Revelation? See the importance of it, and this is more like you take on that scenario.
The four facts that I presented for the evidence of the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead were these. The honorable burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of the empty tomb by Jesus' closest women followers, thirdly, that he made appearances to all sorts of people over a period of 40 days, and then finally, how the disciples went from skepticism to faith. I'm just going to focus on the fourth one for sake of time and to give Mr. Moore a chance to respond. How do we account for how, whenever you scrutinize the gospel records, how the disciples, to a man, responded in either skepticism or cynicism? Over a period of 40 days, Jesus appeared to at least 515 individuals. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 10 verses, Paul recites a creed that he had received. He said, I deliver unto you a matter of first importance, that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, and he was raised from the dead according to the Scriptures. We understand from another letter which he wrote, Galatians chapter 1, that Paul had received that particular creed 3 years after his conversion. After he had been converted, which would have been around 34, 35 AD, roughly a year after Jesus' death and resurrection, he went down to Arabia, spent 3 years, and then when he came back up to Jerusalem, he corresponded with the apostles, and they delivered unto him that particular creed. So what 1 Corinthians 15 does, it actually takes us to within at least 3 years of the events in question. So how was it that Saul of Tarsus, known as Paul, he was the number one public enemy of the early church. He was the persecutor of persecutors. How was it that he went from skepticism to faith? Whenever you look at Jewish beliefs in general, they believed that resurrection was something that would take place at the end of history, and it would occur to multiple individuals. There is nothing in Jewish literature written between Old and New Testaments or any of that sort that suggests that resurrection would occur to an individual in history. And yet these disciples, even Jesus' own brothers who didn't believe that who he said he was while he was ministering, they each, as individuals, one by one, came to this startling conclusion: God raised Jesus from the dead. And my contention was this: no naturalistic explanation can account for all of the facts in question. They break down. Maybe someone stole the body, or maybe the disciples had a hallucination, and so on. But those appearances and how we account for them, and how we account for how those disciples went from skepticism to faith, they had a transformative experience that happened in time and space, that was not a delusion, that was not a hallucination, but had physical features. Jesus, for example, he ate bread and fish in front of his disciples. So over a period of 40 days, there were a dozen of these appearances to over 500 individuals. And my contention would be that God raising Jesus from the dead best explains the evidence at hand.
It's okay. It's interesting that Reverend Smith raises the issue of the citation of the appearance before the 500 people. Interestingly, there's only that the reference of that only appears once in the Bible, and that was accepted as canonical because it agreed with the creed that Reverend Smith agreed to. Now, as a journalist, my first question is, okay, who wrote the creed? We don't know. So the biblical accounts of Jesus are considered canonical, and there were numerous others written that during the very early years of Christianity. There were many different versions of what Jesus did, what he meant, what exactly happened, what the purpose of his being on earth was. And these were eventually, the heretical versions were eventually conquered by the one that survived. And the one that survived was the one that agreed with the ones that the early church fathers said was this creed. Now, we don't know who wrote the creed. We don't know where it came from. And so maybe the answer, the naturalistic answer of the empty tomb is maybe it didn't happen. It was a story.
Yes, that the explanation for the origin of the universe by nature, it has to have an external cause to account for its existence. It's a contingent reality. Our universe is a contingent reality. And you'll notice that in the argument that I presented, there are two categories for anything that exists. Things that exist by necessity of their own nature. In other words, if you were to ask that thing, how do you account for why you exist? They would point to their own nature. Or, secondly, things that exist because of an external cause to bring them about. Now, in terms of God and theism that I'm presenting, God by nature is a necessary being. In other words, he is his own reason for existence. In other words, he has existed without beginning. So when we look at the universe, the fact that it requires an external cause to account for its existence. We have a cause that could bring about the universe that did not require an external cause to bring it about. Now, there's only a handful of things that could qualify as a necessarily existent thing. I cited one of them. Some mathematicians, for example, believe that numbers necessarily exist. But the thing is, numbers are abstract objects, and abstract objects have no causal relations to anything. So that leaves us then with a necessary cause that by its very nature accounts for its own existence, but it also has a will. And so whenever you look at the cause of the universe, that cause would be God, because God fits that explanation as he has been
physiological reason for us to believe how we do that. And that's what the argument is. That's why we believe that we're wired to be, not necessarily it's true, because that's the way we're wired. What was the second question? least to some extent, because of physiological processes.
There is, when we talk about theism, Christian theism in particular, we talk about how God's relationship with the providence has to do with God's oversight and governance of all history, nations, and people. So God operates in a way in unity. So the idea that God has to set natural laws and to it, we see the history of that is similar to some of the other individual. So, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier, God in nature, He created in such a way that He created an opportunity to hiding Himself and making Himself known. I would say God does operate through some of those laws that include laws, rules, and decisions, all of the laws. That doesn't mean God doesn't operate indirectly, but He also does things through That's how I would basically summarize God.
the legend of Atlas is on the strong. It means deep beyond the practice of God. 1250 BC. Is that going to be this was like we count somewhere where the starting point is we count Atlas. From working with Reverend Smith, I learned, thankfully, that not all pastors in this region would want to get me fired from my job, for my writing. So, but no, it's been a wonderful experience working with him. He's reached out to me in a very meaningful way about my writing and about my beliefs, and it's been a wonderful experience. And what I've learned here tonight is there's a wonderful diversity of thought right in this region, and this is I think this is a very necessary process to dig, to ask questions, and to demand answers that make sense.
I think in my interactions with Jerry, I think he has taught me and has reminded me that when you decide to hold to a certain position, there will come a time when that position is going to be questioned. 1 Peter chapter 3:15 says that we need to be ready to give a defense for the reason for the hope that's within us. But we're to do so with all respect and dignity. And the one thing I appreciate about Mr. Moore, he and I agreed from the very beginning when we were planning this debate that we were going to treat each other with dignity and respect. And I feel like he has done that. I appreciated the article. Yeah. I appreciated the tenor and the tone of the article that he wrote this past week. And so I think that's one thing that I've gained from working with Mr. Moore. And then concerning the audience, I think the audience has demonstrated that the issue of God and his existence is the continental divide of human thought. It is the single most important question. If you canvass all of Western thought, Western philosophy, even if you go over into Eastern philosophy, the issue and the question of what constitutes ultimate reality and how people respond to that. I think everyone here tonight has demonstrated that, and that the existence or the non-existence of God is something of which you cannot be on the fence about. It is something of which you must make a decision, consider all of the evidence, as well as the explanations for the evidence. And each one of us are responsible as to where and how we respond to that. And so that's what I've learned from the audience tonight.